Welcome back. Today we are looking at the Canon 70D, and this camera was actually a landmark release for video shooters when it came out. First thing we want to do is to switch to a movie mode, and you do that by using this switch at the back of the camera, and you are now in video mode. Once you are in video mode, you then press the start stop button in the center of that switch to begin recording, and you press it again to stop recording. Your exposure information is displayed along the bottom of the screen. So before you start shooting, you want to make sure that your exposure mode is set to manual. So you turn the mode dial on the top of the camera to M, and shooting video in any automatic mode means the camera can actually shift your exposure while you're recording or mid-clip in response to any change in lighting. And that change in lighting or flickering, pumping the exposure, will ruin your footage. Manual mode locks everything in and gives you consistent, controlled results. Next, we want to look at the video system. So one important video setting on the Canon 70D is the choice between NTSC and PAL. This setting determines which frame rates are available when recording video. So in NTSC mode, you have options such as 30 frames per second and 60 frames per second. While in PAL mode, you're going to see 25 frames per second and 50 frames per second. And traditionally, NTSC is used in countries such as the United States, Canada, Japan, while PAL is most common in Europe, Africa, Australia, and mostly the rest of the world. So if you're creating for television broadcast, it's usually best to match the standard used in your country. For online platforms like YouTube, either system will work. Next, we want to look at resolution and frame rate. So you want to set that. And you press the menu and you go to Video tab 2. That's where you find the settings and select Movie Recording Size. Video resolution refers to the amount of detail in each frame of your video. So higher resolutions such as 1920 by 1080, which is the maximum you can get on this camera. That's called Full HD, and it contains more pixels and produces sharper images, while lower resolutions have fewer pixels and less detail. So the 70D gives you 3 resolution options. The first one is your Full HD, that's 1920 by 1080. You can shoot at lower resolutions like the 1280 by 720, which is called HD. This is a lower resolution, but it unlocks higher frame rates. That's the plus for that resolution. More on that in a moment. 640 by 480 is also available. This is standard definition. I don't know that anyone shoots standard definition anymore. There's very little reason to use this unless you have severe storage constraints. Basically, stay at 1920 by 1080 for the best quality footage on this camera. So let's move on and look at frame rates. You need to choose your frame rates. You have a choice of 24, 30, and 60 in NTSC, or 24, 25, and 50 in PAL. Frame rate is simply how many individual images or frames the camera captures every second, because video is basically a series of still images in sequence. So the higher the number of those still images, the smoother the motion will look. So you have 24 frames per second, or more precisely, it's actually 23.98 frames per second. And everyone says this is the cinematic frame rate or cinematic standard. This is the frame rate that movies have been shot at for over 100 years. And our eyes sort of associate it with that filmic, slightly dreamlike quality you see in movies and narrative video. So if you want your footage to look like a film rather than a home video, then shoot at 24 frames per second. And this is the setting a lot of video creators and filmmakers default to. You also have 30 frames per second in NTSC, or more accurately 29.97, or 25 frames per second in PAL. It looks slightly smoother than 24 frames per second. And then you have 60 frames per second in NTSC, or 50 frames per second in PAL, and that's only available at HD resolution of 720p. At 60 frames per second, you can slow your footage down at half speed in post, in editing, and get that beautifully smooth slow motion. So if you're shooting someone throwing a ball, a dancer jumping, water splashing, anything with fast movements, at 60 frames per second or 50 frames per second, you can then slow it down to 30 frames or 25 frames per second in your editing software, and you get that silky, dramatic slow motion. The trade-off is that you drop to 720p resolution. Next, let's look at something that's really important, and we call this the 180-degree shutter rule. This is probably the single most important concept in video shooting that beginners need to know about. Let's go back to photography. In photography, you can set your shutter speed to almost anything. Video, on the other hand, is completely different. If your shutter speed is wrong, your footage will either look unnaturally choppy or unnaturally smooth. So here's the rule. Your shutter speed for video should always be approximately double your frame rate. This is called the 180-degree shutter rule. Digital cameras inherited this principle because this produces the most natural motion blur on moving subjects. In practice, here's what that means on your 70D. If you're shooting at 24 frames per second, then you set your shutter speed to 1/150th of a second. That's the closest available option to double of 24. So you don't have 1/48th of a second shutter speed on this camera. So you go to the next one, which is 1/50. If you're shooting at 30 frames per second, set your shutter speed to 1/60th of a second. So that's exactly double. If you're shooting at 60 frames per second for slow motion, then set your shutter speed to 1/125th of a second. Again, that's the closest to 1/120. So lock these in and don't change them. Your shutter speed in video is not a tool for controlling exposure like in photography. It's fixed by the frame rate. So how do you control exposure then? That's what aperture and ISO are for in video. Now, aperture is your first tool, and in video, it does double duty. It controls both how much light hits the sensor, because it's the opening of your lens, and it also controls how much background blur you get. A wide aperture is something like f1.8 or f2.8 creates a shallow depth of field. So you can see I'm recording at f1.8 right now on the camera, and the background is blurred. And you see this a lot in professional video. And a narrow aperture, on the other hand, something like f8 or f11, keeps everything in focus, which is great for landscape and wide establishing shots where you want everything to be in focus. So start by setting your aperture for the look you want. Do you want background blur, or do you want everything in focus? Then once you've decided that, you can use your ISO or ISO to fine-tune your brightness. You want to keep that as low as possible while maintaining a good exposure. The 70D handles mid-range ISO very well. Anything up to around 1600 is generally clean enough for video. When you start pushing it past 3200, you start seeing noise creeping into your shadows or the dark areas of your image. So use the exposure meter at the bottom of the live view screen as a guide, and you want to aim at keeping it centered. Next, we want to look at autofocus in the video. Go to Video tab 1 in the menu and make sure Movie Servo AF is turned on. This enables continuous autofocus tracking throughout your recording. Your autofocus method options during video are the same ones we covered in the live view tutorial, if you watched that. That is phase detection and tracking for people, flexi-zone multi for general subjects, and flexi-zone single for precise placement. For most video work with a person on screen, face detection is your best starting point. For more critical or controlled shooting, like interviews on the tripod, manual focus gives you the most precise and reliable results. Let's talk about audio, because bad audio will ruin good video footage faster than almost anything else. The 70D has a built-in stereo microphone, and it works, but it picks up camera handling noises. So if you are doing this, it picks that up. It picks up the autofocus motor sound and everything that's happening around you equally. For anything beyond just casual reference audio, you want an external microphone. Now the 70D has a 3mm jack on the side here, and this is where you plug in your external microphones. One important limitation to know up front though is that there's no headphone jack on the 70D for monitoring audio while you record. Because of this limitation, you may actually want to invest in a budget external recorder where you plug in your mic, record and monitor the audio as you are shooting video, and then sync it in the video in post using reference audio that is recorded internally on the camera. And this is a huge upgrade over the built-in mic. For sit-down interviews, a lavalier microphone or this kind of microphone that I'm using right now will give you even cleaner, more intimate audio because it's physically close to the speaker's mouth. Let's look at setting your audio levels. How do you do that? So once your microphone is connected, you go to the video tab number 2 and find sound recording. And this is where you control how your audio is captured. You have two main options. One is auto and the other one is manual. Auto lets the camera continuously adjust the recording level in response to how loud or quiet the sound is. Now the problem with recording in auto is that it never stops moving. The levels never stop moving. In a quiet moment between sentences, the camera will boost the gain trying to find sound. And you hear that as a rushing noise or hiss in your audio. Then when someone speaks, it pulls back. So that constant pumping is unpleasant and hard to fix in post. It's almost impossible to fix in post. So avoid auto for anything serious that you are recording. Manual is where you want to be. Set your level by speaking or making the sound you'll be recording, watching the audio meters that appear on the live screen. You want your levels to be peaking somewhere in the middle of the scale, so roughly around the halfway mark during normal speech or sound. And occasionally you may get peaks into the higher range, and those are fine. But if the meters are constantly hitting the top and going into the red, then your audio is definitely clipping. There's also a wind filter option in the sound recording menu. Turn this on when you are shooting outdoors. It applies a low frequency roll-off. It significantly reduces wind noise on those microphones. The attenuator function in the Canon 70D reduces the strength of the audio signal before it is recorded by the camera. So think of it as turning down the volume of very loud sounds to prevent distortion, clipping, or crackling in your audio recordings. You may want to enable the attenuator when recording in, say, noisy environments, such as concerts or live events, sporting events, or when using microphones that produce a particularly strong output signal. For normal speech recordings, interviews, and most video work, it's usually best to just leave the attenuator turned off unless you're experiencing audio overload problems. Next, we want to look at white balance. Auto white balance continuously adjusts as the camera sees the different colors and light intensities in the scene. And you see the color of the image shift as the camera recalculates. And so when you try and cut between two clips shot on auto white balance in slightly different lighting, you'll see the color jump noticeably. So instead, pick a manual white balance preset that matches your lighting conditions. So something like daylight for outdoor sun, tungsten for indoor bulb lighting, cloudy for overcast conditions, and so on. And then lock it in before you press record. And better yet though, set a custom white balance using a gray card or a white sheet of paper. So that gives you perfectly neutral color throughout your entire shoot, and every clip will match. Let's look at some of the settings in the picture style settings and how we can get the best image out of the camera. So go to tab number 4 in the shooting menu and select a picture style. For video, I would say the two best starting options are neutral and faithful. So both of these reduce the in-camera processing that the Canon applies: less saturation, less contrast, less sharpening. And here's why this matters. The more processing the camera bakes into the image, the less latitude you have to adjust it in post. So a flat neutral image gives your editing software much more information to work with. You can always add contrast and saturation in post, but you can't recover details from highlight that's already blown out, the whites that are already blown out, or shadows and blacks that are already crushed by processing in camera. Whichever style you choose, you can press the info button to enter the detailed settings, and you can dial these adjustments down to get even a flatter image. So I'd advise that maybe set the sharpness to 0 or 1, because in-camera sharpening on video creates an artificial, overly crisp edge that looks digital. So apply sharpening in post where you have more control. Next, set your contrast down to -2 or -3. And this opens up your dynamic range. That's the difference between your very bright and your very dark areas. And so it protects those highlights and shadows simultaneously. Leave your saturation at 0 or even reduce it slightly to -1, because oversaturated video doesn't look really good on most screens. So these settings together give you a softer, flatter image straight out of the camera, which is exactly what you want as your starting point for color grading in post. So those are the main settings that you are going to work with on the 70D to get started on shooting video. And that's it for today. See you on the next one. And if you found this video helpful, make sure you subscribe, make sure you hit that like button and hit the notification bell so that you get notified whenever I upload new videos. That really helps the channel. See you on the next one.